Breathe in, breathe out. No, really. Breathe in, breathe out. When I breathe in, I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I breathe out love. When I breathe in, I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I breathe out love. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I and several of us on the panel here are Zooming to you from West Philadelphia, where in the last few days we've seen for probably the millionth time how important the role of the faith community is in really painful moments of injustice. And I'm also Zooming to you as part of Count Every Vote, which is the 501c3 arm of the Fight Back table. And Count Every Vote has been hard at work doing exactly what it sounds like, making sure that in the very strange election coming up, that every single vote is counted. And we are very, very clear that the faith community is going to be crucial for that moment, because we know that at tense moments, we are best equipped to help de-escalate, to guide people onto the streets. Many people here are leaders, to speak to so many people at one time, and to speak in one voice about the morality of what's happening. So this series of trainings is designed to equip faith leaders for doing that work, for being present in the most powerful and grounded ways. And Bend the Arc, which is anchoring the Count Every Vote Faith Network, is so excited to be doing this jointly, these trainings with Faith in Public Life. And we're so happy to have you here. We've already trained almost 500 people from 30 states since we started these trainings last week. So there is a real appetite among our siblings of faith communities all across the country to learn how to get out on the streets, how to talk to the media, how to talk to each other, and how to do that safely and powerfully, in as much safety as is possible in a moment like this. So a little bit after this, after I'm done talking, we're going to hear for a moment from a recording of Reverend Tracy Blackman, who spoke on our training last week and who was such a powerful leader in Ferguson on the ground and many moments since. And then we are so fortunate to hear tonight from Graie Hagans, who is someone I deeply respect and who is the Vision Praxis Director at Bend the Arc, who's going to lead us through some of the basics of direct action and making sure that we can, as much as possible, be prepared, be safe, be in close communication with each other, and playing our unique role as a faith community. So with that, I do want to note we are recording tonight's session. The materials will be available later. And again, if you just joined us, I'd like to ask people to put your name and your faith community and your location in the chat, because it's really powerful, especially in this webinar format where we can't see each other's faces, to get to feel, wow, this is a movement all across the country of people of faith that know our moment has come and that we are needed.
I just want to talk with you just a few moments from a clergy standpoint. I too was in Ferguson. I live in Florissant, Missouri, and the to Ferguson is a long one that I will with you some other time. But there are things that I think are helpful to those who want to show up and protest as people of faith, particularly as clergy in this moment. When Ferguson uprising began, we had a lot of confusion when we started. One of the reasons we had confusion is because most clergy did not have relationship with the protesters that ended up in the streets in the beginning. And it is important that we recognize as clergy that if we don't have that relationship, we don't have to be ashamed of that. We are there now. We don't have to not show up. That is not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we cannot expect to lead where we're not. So when we show, we must respect the leadership that is in place at that protest. It's helpful if at clergy, as clergy, you have the ability to set your own affinity group and have your own meetings. And the reason this is helpful is for some of the reasons that PJ talked about. Because as anxiety rises, as stress rises, as unknown and unexpected things begin to happen, the anxiety internally begins to rise. And if you have not grounded yourself as a community, spent some time talking about what your role is going to be in the streets, you can end up doing more harm than help. So in Ferguson, the clergy got together and decided what our role will be. And I'm not suggesting that in every area the role has to be the same, but for us, we decided that we were going to be the keepers of the story. We were going to be the ones who would use their authority, their position, their collars, their stoles, their whatever your tradition calls for. We were going to come in that and make sure that we were the keepers of the story, that we were not going to allow media, we were not going to allow law enforcement, we were not going to allow elected officials to tell a story that was not accurate and was not true. And we were not going to allow protesters who were simply fighting for the right to exist without persecution and prosecution to be painted as something that they were not. We were the keepers of the story. One of the ways we did that was we created teams of two clergy as partners, two clergy partnering together, and we had a schedule. We committed to being in the street whenever protesters were in the street. That's a big commitment, because contrary to popular opinion, most clergy are not out in the street. And so if you're going to do this, and if you're going to do it in a way that the protest community of which you would be saying you want to be a part can depend upon you, then you need to be reliable to show up in the streets. And so we would do that by having a partnership and having a schedule when we always knew who was assigned to be out in the streets. And if things got rough, if things got violent on that night, those two people would call and say, we need more clergy in the street, or those 6 people, or those 8 people. It varied depending upon the size of the protest. But we were clear about who we were and why we were there. PJ answered a question about standing in front of people to be a barrier between them and the police, or between them and violence, or whatever we might think we were doing. We did some of that in Ferguson, quite frankly, but we always did it in conjunction with the protesters whose leadership we were following. Following that leadership also meant that we had to leave some of our respectability and politeness at home. Now, I'm not asking that you be someone that you are not, and certainly I was not someone that I was not. There's certain language that I don't use, and I didn't use it. But I also did not try to police other people's voice, their ways of expression, their language, their actions. That was not my role. My role was to be the keeper of the story and to be clear about what I stood for. And what I stand for is justice, wherever it is coming from. And in the cases of Ferguson and so many of the protests that have happened around this nation, justice stands with those who are being persecuted and prosecuted by militarized violence from law enforcement, from servants of the state, servants of the people. And we stood with protesters. We stood with them even when law enforcement got angry with us. We stood with them even when law enforcement called us traitors. We stood with them even when our collars made us targets instead of made us accomplices of law enforcement. You need to know what you stand for, who you stand for, before you go out into the streets.
Thank you. As Cecily mentioned before, my name is Graie Hagans, and I am the Vision Praxis Director at Bend the Arc, and I am joining you all from Lenni Lenape territories, also known as West Philadelphia. And also, as Cecily named earlier, Cecily, Koach, and myself have been present for quite a few things on the streets in the last couple of evenings. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to use a little bit of that experience as well this evening, as we say, grounded in some practice together and some understanding about this moment and how we show up. I will likely be taking lots of breaths, and I invite you to do so as well. I'm definitely feeling that sense of kind of the heaviness and the urgency of the moment that we're in right now. And there's a couple of invitations I want to bring to us. The first invitation is the one that my brother Koach started us with. That's the invitation to breathe. Much of what I've learned over the last few years about being in actions in the street and being in nonviolent action is the way to be in relationship to body and the way to be in relationship to one's breath. And in my tradition in Judaism, sometimes we equate breath with divinity, the idea of the Shekhinah, that there is a spirit, there's a breath of divinity that lives in creation, and that our creation comes from that. And so it is always a holy act when we pause to take enough breath to sustain ourselves so that we can stay anchored enough to sustain one another. So I invite you to breathe when you feel the need to breathe. The second invitation I want to make is calling back to some of the things that Reverend Blackman gave to us. And one of the things that she said in the clip that we just saw is, we cannot lead where we have not been. And I've been thinking a lot about, if you know me over a certain amount of time, and if you've seen me on a call before, I like to wander my way back into the Exodus and really thinking about what does it mean for Moses. Moses, who we think about in many of our traditions as a great leader, and in my tradition, certainly in Judaism, as the great kind of liberator and leader of the people out of a narrow place into a wide place, into liberation and into freedom and into possibility. And in my tradition, our text, the Torah, ends by saying, there shall be no leader like Moses. And yet Moses had to reconnect with his people, and he had to learn how to move beside his siblings in order to become all of that. Moses had to be nudged into that by other people. Moses had to be told that he didn't have to always have the right things to say, that he could go and find his brother Aaron, and his brother Aaron would speak for him. And he didn't have to figure out how to gather the people around him. He was told his sister, Miriam, was already a gatherer of the people. And he was able to draw wisdom from his father-in-law and so much from so many people. And he had to learn really how to be in community as a person who'd been expelled from community in multiple ways. He had to learn how to come back to it and how to move with it in right relationship to make all of that possibility. And so tonight, my second invitation is to be thinking about who you are in relationship to other people. We're going to be thinking about this, what it means to be the keepers of the story, as Reverend Blackman mentioned. And I know folks last night attended a messaging training. Is that correct? So that third invitation is just to be thinking about that as well. I did not attend that training, so I cannot speak directly to that. So as an invitation to you as a leader and a learner to be thinking about that learning and how to integrate it moving forward. Can we go to SlideShare, please? Thank you. So as I was rewatching Reverend Blackman's video from the first version of this that we did maybe a week or two ago, I was thinking about some guiding questions that I wanted to introduce to us. And oftentimes I spend a lot of my time in Zoom spaces training folks, and usually I have a little bit more room to reach in and touch y'all. And since this is a webinar, we're gonna have to move through some things a little bit quicker, but I do invite folks to continue to use the chat as you have been to lift up questions, things like that, and share learnings and other things. I will be throughout the call sharing out resources. There'll also be some prompts and things like that. So I also invite you in relationship to our guiding questions tonight to find somewhere that you want to be taking notes, whether that is on your computer, on your phone, voice notes, write them down, whatever way feels best to you. Because I'll also be making some invitations for you to do some reflection and some journaling throughout our call as well. We're scheduled to be here, I think, till 9 p.m. Eastern time. My goal is to wrap us before that time, because a lot of the things I'm going to introduce are really things for you to sit down or move however you move, and to do and to start putting into practice. So I don't want to keep you for longer if you can move your time in other ways. So some of our guiding questions I want to introduce based on what we heard Reverend Blackman say. The first is thinking about, what community do you need to be a part of in this work? Who do you need to move alongside of, and who are you going to be accountable to? And I challenge you to get very clear about that. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of forming, Reverend Blackman called them affinity groups, but I'm calling them pods, to think about some of that, about like then how you're in relationship to other faith leaders, how you communicate with one another securely, and how will you show up with one another. And then also thinking about how you stay grounded in who you are and what are you grounded for. Reverend Blackman talks about being able to like stand in that and be firm in it. So how do we stay connected both in our values and our vision and our position, and also in our breath and our bodies? Can you go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to invite you, actually, let's go back to the previous slide. Thank you. I'm going to invite you to take the next 4 minutes. And for some folks, I know this might feel miserable to be a little quiet for 4 minutes on a webinar. Maybe if we're nice to them, Koach will bless us with some background drumming. But I'm going to invite you just to take 4 minutes and start to think about these questions. For some folks, that 4 minutes may be filled with your just recording these questions. And for some other folks, that 4 minutes may be filled with doodling and drawing and thinking. For some folks, it may be breathing. But I want you to find a place to hold these questions. And then in 4 minutes, I'm going to invite you into something else. invite you to wrap up if you are still writing. That can look like this, or that can look like this. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I was sitting with two of the questions that Reverend Blackman named for us, which were that challenge of knowing what you stand for and who you stand for. And I want to invite you now to use the chat to take a moment to name what you stand for and who you stand for. We have people in our space who stand for the transformation of the earth, for the regeneration of the life force. People are standing for the whole earth community and justice and equality for all. And standing for every human being created in God's image and deserving dignity and respect that entails. There are folks here who stand for and with God. People who stand here for racial justice and for a moral voice of people of faith. We're in the company of people who stand with justice and inclusion and justice and mercy for all children of God who are oppressed. We're in the company of people who stand for justice and equity for all people, and for social transformation, which includes a reckoning with history and accounting of harm and the future we are building together. And in our company are also people who stand for God's promise to us that we all deserve dignity and respect, and the spark of divinity in all persons and all beings. For my nieces and nephews and all the children, people who stand for the aspiration of what America could be. We are in the company of revolutionary love. I invite you all to, throughout the call, please continue to name what you stand for and who you stand for. I really find this as like a central practice and call of Reverend Blackman's statement of being very clear about that, and that all our work should come from that place. In some models of organizing, we call that self-interest. In some models, we call that love, our heart, the thing that pulls us and moves us in the ways we need. Think about the thing that keeps us grounded. It's the roots and the things that we grow, the things we flower and the things we bloom. So we're thinking about what we stand for and who we stand for. We think about what does that have to do with this moment that we're in, and what does that have to do with gathering together as people around nonviolent action? Can we pause screen share, please? Thank you. So we're going to spend a bit of our call now thinking explicitly about nonviolent action, what it is, primarily, maybe a little bit about what it's not. We're going to talk about why it is strategic right now. We're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about what are tactics and what are ways for us to show up. If there's time and energy, we can do my favorite thing and talk a little bit about Exodus. But I want to also spend some time talking about building a pod and gathering your people. And we'll have a moment to do a little bit of a modeling of a practice we've been trying out in Philly over the past couple of nights. And I want to just do a quick conversation about security stuff and digital things. And then my brother Koach is going to take us into thinking about, like, again, how do we stay in our roots in the streets a little bit. So when we think about nonviolent action, I want to first be very, very clear about what it is we're talking about. You might have heard Reverend Blackman say some things about how we need to let go of some of our constructions and some of our ideas about, I believe she said, being so polite in some ways. She said we had to leave some of our respectability and politeness at home. And for some folks, that might feel like it actually butts up against our ideas of nonviolence, our ideas of being peaceable, right? I feel excited because I feel like I come from a tradition in which peace, like shalom, means like it can be raucous, it can be big. It doesn't have to fit into a container of quiet, of silence. And also holding the space where peace is big silence, and all the ways and all the things that that fills as well. Point is, there's a spectrum of what it is and how we experience it. When I'm talking about nonviolent action tonight, sometimes it gets referred to as people power. Sometimes it gets referred to as nonviolent struggle or nonviolent resistance or nonviolent direct action. Sometimes folks use that language. But nonviolent action really is a technique of action for applying power in a conflict by using symbolic protest, non-cooperation, and defiance, but not physical violence. And that definition comes from the Albert Einstein Institute, which also talks about how nonviolent action can include acts of omission and commission. That means it can include refraining from usual activity, or it can mean taking action that one may not otherwise take. The spectrum of nonviolence can be about what we choose to do and what we choose not to do. What and how we are complicit in actions, and what and how we actually withdraw our support from actions. The point of all of it is, the most important thing, is that nonviolent action is action that is nonviolent. And for some folks, that spectrum of violence and nonviolence, there's a spectrum there, and I encourage you to dig into that. And there's some resources you can find online for grappling with what is a spectrum of nonviolence. For many people, that looks like a focus on do no harm. For some folks, that looks like refraining from things such as property damage, symbolic or real. But again, to find yourself grounded in what is your spectrum of practice. But nonviolent action is really primarily focused on power. It's focused on building power and challenging the core sources of power of a target. And that means that we have to understand also how power functions and how power works. So unfortunately, I can't see you all do this with me, but I do encourage you to actually do this for a moment. This will be a call in which you are invited to use your bodies within ways that feel comfortable to you. But I want to invite you into a way of thinking about power right now, and why we're going to talk about why nonviolent action is critical in this understanding of power. I initially learned that power operates kind of like this, in a structure that looks much like a pyramid. I was taught that the goal of the work is to build as much as you can at the base where the people are, and essentially to be able to climb up and overthrow, let's say, Pharaoh. All right, pick your Pharaoh. What this does, though, is it doesn't actually fundamentally challenge what upholds a system of power. It doesn't actually get at how the system is structured. What it does is actually keeps us in a structure that is actually fundamentally unjust, but looks stable. Because if you take this pyramid and you put it down in front of you on a flat surface and you try to knock it over, you may notice that it doesn't really budge, right? It's a genius of geometry. And so oftentimes we live in a world that actually limits our imagination, because what we try to do is play in this assumption and this model that says that the goal is actually to be at the top, which just cycles us through who ends up at the bottom. And what I've learned is that power actually operates in the opposite direction. Some people call this a people power based model. But I think this is a model that actually helps us get at the reality is that these power structures that we operate in are actually fundamentally unstable. They're unnatural. And so therefore they must be held into place by a series of pillars. If you were to put your hand down now on the table with your fingers in front of you, you will notice that it's actually a lot more stable and you can't knock it over. And the reason is because these pillars are now actually upholding this power structure, in which much of the power is actually obscured. And so when we start to look at and get at what the pillars are, the pillars of support, is when we actually start to get at how we start to shift power and do all those big and beautiful things that we named in the chat earlier about what we stand for and who we stand for. And we actually know that this model works. It's not just something some guy named Graie made up, or that some guy named Graie learned from other people, although this has come through many great teachers for me. We know that this model of power is very real because we've seen it in operation all over the world. A few years ago, two researchers, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffens, found that 3.5% of a population actively involved in sustained movement is the tipping point for great transformation. Because they realized that when people are dedicated to strategic, disciplined, nonviolent action, it pulls the center and it pulls complicity and support from the infrastructure. It actually gets at these different pillars. And we also know that this works in the United States. We know that this works because over the summer, we know that there were veterans and members of the military who got together and started to use their voice collectively. They started to use their ability to nonviolently push back on a system, and were able to get confirmation and like a reaffirmed commitment from the United States military about what role they will play in any direction around the election right now. And that came from vets saying, we are going to be committed to a nonviolent action, looking at our specific role in a specific pillar, and knowing that we have power there. Because they know that as veterans, they have more power in that than I do as a civilian. And so when we're thinking about our relationship to nonviolent action, and when we're thinking about our relationship to those pillars, to be taking on that challenge and thinking about as faith leaders, where do we have access to those pillars? Right? And to think about our activity and our actions focused in those directions. Can we go back to screen share real quick to slide 5, please? Thank you. So I want to introduce very quickly a tool that I learned from trainers here in Philadelphia, such as trainers through Earthquaker Action Team and also through Beautiful Trouble and other folks, which is a resource that is worth checking out. This is called the spectrum of support, or the spectrum of allies. As I was mentioning before, we know that disciplined nonviolent action is deeply strategic because it moves people in their activity, because it actually moves people and pulls kind of the support that we need strategically. And here the focus becomes, instead of focusing on our active opposition and whatever is the situation that we are dealing in, that we're actually focused on moving primarily those who are neutral into passive allies and those who are passive into active allies. So focusing our attention not on those who are the furthest away from us, but kind of focusing in closer in to those who we know just need to be activated, and thinking about what are the ways that we can use our actions and our activities to activate more people to join. And so we know that kind of central and strategic to that is the role of clergy, visible clergy in the streets, as Reverend Blackman talked about. She talked about inaction and inactivity, right? The way that clergy folks being visible changed the tenor of what was happening on the streets, provided very real protection for people who otherwise would have been left unprotected, right? That is actively pulling their oftentimes active opposition or passive opposition into a neutral place, bringing people into a place of actually standing down from harming other people. So when we think about also nonviolence in that way, part of it is the presence of our being and the presence of our body and the tone that we take, particularly holding this role, as Reverend Blackman mentioned several times, is also going to be a critical part of maintaining not only nonviolence of the crowd, but also that do no harm kind of nonviolence. Can we go off a screen share? Thank you. There is a very broad spectrum of the kinds of tactics that one can engage in when thinking about nonviolent action. I'm dropping into the chat right now a link. Make sure I'm doing this right. A link to the Albert Einstein Institute, which I mentioned earlier, where I got that definition for nonviolent action. This is 198 methods of nonviolent action. I'm going to make a safe bet here and say that everyone has seen a press conference. Everyone has seen or participated in a rally. Everyone has seen or participated in a march. But I want to encourage us to think more broadly about the kind of tactics that we can be engaged in, particularly holding those questions that I introduced earlier. And I'm again gonna do a thing that might make some folks uncomfortable about being on a webinar in the silence of it. But I'm gonna invite you to take a few minutes to look at that link. And I'm gonna ask you in 5 minutes to start to answer these 3 questions, to identify these for yourself. The first is a tactic that you feel familiar and experienced with. Second, a tactic that is new to you and that you wanna learn more about. And third, a tactic that feels uncomfortable to you and maybe beyond your limits, something you know you would not participate in. We're going to take about 3 to 5 minutes so that everybody can look at that link and start to identify those 3. You only have to have one for each. I'm seeing some folks are loving number 57 on the 198 tactics. If you want to drop in the chat what number 57 is, that would be great. There's a Spike Lee film about that tactic. All right, folks, I'm going to invite you back into the chat. I promise you that link is yours to keep, and you can revisit that website over and over again. You can also download as a PDF the 198 tactics. Keep it close to you. So the first question that I said I was going to ask was for you all to name a tactic that you feel familiar and experienced with. So I'm going to invite you to start naming tactics that you feel familiar and experienced with. I'm going to jump to letter writing, assuming that's the one that we're starting with, that we're familiar with. Letter writing, guerrilla theater, singing, sit downs, marching, protesting, letter writing. What are other ones that vigils, public statements, public speaking and declarations, boycotting, prayer and worship, march, group lobbying, intentional arrest in front of a legislator, different kinds of strikes, die-ins. So I'm going to invite you now to name a tactic that was new to you that you'd want to learn more about. I know some folks are already adding those in, so you can drop those back down. A new one are pray-ins, collective disappearance, alternative economic institutions at scale, excommunication, alternative social institutions, disrobing, boycott of social affairs, destruction of owned property, protest immigration. What are other tactics that feel new to us that we would be interested in learning about? Portraits, symbolic lights, withdrawal of bank deposits, quickie walkout, lightning strike, nonviolent land seizures. There are tactics of civil disobedience, of illegitimate laws, or disobedience of neutral laws. I don't know how to say that first word, but the lysistratic non-action. Canceling credit cards, exclamation point, refusal of government money, forming a circle around place of power and never leaving, economic shutdowns, generalized strikes and being arrested, humorous skits and pranks. So I'm gonna ask you to just pause for one moment. And just ask yourself, when I asked kind of what were the tactics that felt new to folks that they would be interested in learning more about, I think we got some really interesting things. We got a pretty broad spectrum of the different ways that we can use our bodies and our positions and our roles and our communities and our voices and all the other things that we have in our material possession as nonviolent action. Because again, I said nonviolent action is any action that is nonviolent, right? So economic shutdowns are as equally nonviolent action as are press statements, right? Generalized strikes are as equally nonviolent actions as a withdrawal of bank deposits or symbolic lights or portraits, if we are grounded and practiced in nonviolent discipline. We have to be able to stretch in these different kinds of ways. And so part of that figuring out what is our role is what goes back to those questions of what is our relationship to others? What is our relationship as the story keepers? What is our relationship as the protectors, right? What is our relationship as people who are charged with caring for our people in whatever ways that looks like in our traditions and our practices? So when we think about how we stretch into tactics, it's going to be important to think about how do we stretch into them in ways that are going to do the most effective role in actually challenging power and actually keeping our people safe. And as Reverend Blackman said, we get to do that while also staying who we are. So I invite you now to think about this third one, which is, what are the tactics that feel uncomfortable to you or beyond your limits? And holding that uncomfortable is different than I don't know how to do it yet, right? Taunting feels beyond our limits or uncomfortable. The different kinds of nonviolent raids, excommunication, mock funerals and mutiny, rude gestures, hunger strike, the disrobing one, depending on how one understands that, fasting, hiding fake identities, not paying taxes, anything that violates the dignity and worth of others. There was a question in there as well about, or kind of like a feeling of some of these feel like they may not be nonviolent, right? And as I mentioned before, there's a spectrum, I think, of things we talk about when we say nonviolent action. So if I may give my 120-second spiel about considerations for us all to hold when we're talking about nonviolence. One, we have to do some exploration about what our sense of nonviolence is rooted in, both in terms of what our sense of nonviolence is rooted in terms of our faith traditions, but also what our sense of nonviolence is rooted in terms of it has to contend with the way that people are racialized in this country. It has to contend with the way that people are gendered in this country. It has to contend with the ideas about class in this country and many other things. So when I think about what it means to be nonviolent, right, some of that also means about nonviolent to who and who gets to claim the space of nonviolence. I hope we can be honest in this space that the reality is there are assumptions about violence that are put on my body that would not be put on Cecily. May I use you as an example? On Cecily as an example, right? And part of that has to do with the way that people's identities are constructed around violence. And so sometimes thinking about what we mean when we say violence means doing some kind of internal and communal work about what do we actually mean when we say violence? Do we mean disruptive? Is that violence for us? Do we mean to be made uncomfortable? Is that violence to us? I am going to share this story because it's a webinar and I have the microphone. I recall doing a training similar to this with my brother Koach back home in St. Louis and telling a story about a nonviolent action that we took. Do you remember this, bro? Took a non-violent action. And bro, I'm gonna ask you to participate in this with me a little bit, if we may. We were a part of a group of folks who were dedicated for the day of shutting down malls on what we kind of affectionately call in this country Black Friday, meaning one of the biggest sales days of the year, the day following Thanksgiving, right? A day where we know actually is mired by violence every single year. That has become a normative thing in the United States, that on big shopping days, when shopping centers are crowded, that we expect that there will be violence, and we kind of gloss over it in like pretty heinous ways that people experience violence in shopping centers the day after Thanksgiving. And so we arrived as a part of coordinated actions across the city to shut down malls through what at the time we were doing like die-ins, and folks saw those all over the country. And what that meant was we would arrive at a mall, oftentimes as little groups throughout the day. And at some point there would be a signal and people would lay on the ground or the floor of the mall in a die-in and basically shut down the mall. Either there were enough of us to just hold it and shut it down, or in order to clear us out, they would have to shut down the mall themselves. The point there was, though, to get at the profits for the day, right? That we knew that if even for a little while, if we could actually wedge in to the profit in the area, that would mean something. And I remember recalling this story to a room of people a couple years later in a training. And I started to tell this story as somebody else started to ask questions about violence. And I said, well, at the end of the day, we went to the final mall. And as someone who spent almost my entire life in St. Louis, I had never been to this mall in my life. I had never been to Chesterfield Mall in my life. And I spent almost my entire life in St. Louis, Missouri. And so my first time going there was to do this die-in. And my brother and I arrived with a couple other people and we separate. And bro, I believe you went down to the food court. And we said we would meet up later. And so my sister and I, we walked off. And all of a sudden, we heard screaming. We heard screaming, and I saw an entire family of people running through the mall as if they were being attacked by like something that had to be otherworldly. It was a kind of screaming I had only ever actually seen in movies, right? An entire family running away screaming. And we go to the window at the store, and someone says to us, someone that works at the store says, no, there's just protesters in the food court like there always are, right? Like there have been all day long. There have been protesters throughout the mall all day long. And bro, can you share with us what the sound was that was happening in the food court at the time?
Yeah, it was something like this. I know that we will win. I know that we will win. I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. Or show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Yeah.
That sound coming from a person in their body gathered with other people in similar looking bodies in a mall during the largest shopping day of the year. In which if you've been to a mall or a shopping center around that time, it is not uncommon to hear music. It is not uncommon for there to be large crowds. It is not uncommon for people to be gathered. It is not uncommon to have people in your way or have to wait. Yet we spent the entire day with people stepping on us physically. Right? We spent the day showing up in the word of justice and having people run from the mall as if we were Godzilla attacking. Right? Which makes sense when we understand the racist history of Godzilla as well. That's not the point tonight, right? The point is when we think about nonviolence, we have to also be like in a place of real critical thinking about what it means when we're talking about nonviolence. And that also means that we never have to step into a place that actually doesn't feel like it's the place for us. And so our work there is less to understand and dictate or moralize about who gets to be nonviolence and who gets to claim it, particularly when if the two of us show up somewhere, there's an assumption of violence that's going to be very different than if some other people show up. So instead, the work that we have to do then is understanding how do we maintain a core and a discipline of nonviolence that is not flexible in its commitment to nonviolence, but is flexible in the way that it uses those tactics, that it is focused, right, on what it is that we are trying to achieve. And again, as Reverend Blackman said, always keeping with like maintaining who we are. And I'm not an expert in all these tactics. I offer these as like explore these, learn more about them. I can also share a resource possibly after this, maybe Cecily and report out, or folks want to look up some of the work at like Swarthmore, which has a database of all of nonviolent movements and nonviolent actions, and you can get a better sense of like what they've looked like. Or also checking out Beautiful Trouble, which has a lot of great resources as well, and we can share. So I want to pivot us now into then thinking about if we're holding, thank you, Cecily. And if you also have the link for Beautiful Trouble, if you can drop that in there as well. I highly recommend Beautiful Trouble. It is broken down into being able to understand, look at tactics, or if you're more interested in some of the theory or things like that. If you're referencing the story that I just shared about Koach and I, no, you may not share the story. Thank you for asking. Thinking then about like, what does this mean? How do we hold that discipline? And what does that mean then when we're actually together in movement? whether that is in the streets or wherever we may find ourselves at taking nonviolent action together. And as Reverend Blackman said, she encouraged folks to think about forming an affinity group as clergy. And I'll be using the language of pod, or rather like kind of how do you think about gathering your people? And I'm gonna share here a resource that uses the language of, I'll show the resource in a moment. So thinking about how do you form a pod? And really thinking about like one of the things that we've experienced moving through COVID is suddenly people learning and stretching about how to be in relationships of care in brand new ways. Has anybody throughout all of this like formed a new pod or found yourself in new relationships of care with people? You can just put a nod in the chat if so. Mm-hmm. So we've learned all these new kinds of ways of being differently accountable to one another, right? We've learned how that we've had to talk about things that we may not have talked about it previously, right? We're having different conversations about our health and our limitations and our commitment to protect one another's health and safety. And we've built out all kinds of things to do that, right? From folks who may have like taken all this good learning they've had from, doing support for folks around life cycle events, the times that you bring food to care for folks, the time that you set up structures of care for people to be involved. And we've learned how to do that in this brand new way. And so some of that is going to be similar in thinking about what does it mean to form out a pod. There is no magic guide. There are a bunch of different guides, but there is no magic guide to tell you exactly how to do this. So I want to encourage you to think about all the different ways that you've brought together community intentionally with boundaries and practice together. And we're going to think about that in relationship to how do we maintain a balanced discipline around nonviolent action while showing up, knowing that part of our position is keeping the message and supporting the people who are leading the actions on the ground and not overtaking control, right? It's going to require some balance for us. And the first thing I want to offer us around some of that balance is thinking about how you gather your pod, finding the people who you want to be able to take action with, and forming out action agreements and commitments, and figuring out how you make quick decisions with each other. And so when you're thinking about your action agreements and commitments, those look like having some of this conversation around what do you mean when you say nonviolence? So for instance, seeing in the chat right now, right, folks are doing a little bit of that grappling around, okay, when we're thinking about nonviolence, like here are these tactics, an occupation doesn't feel like for me like it can ever be nonviolent, right? That is good to know, and let that boundary then the activity that you are going to take, right? And figure out what are the other kinds of tactics, other kind of activities that you can show up more fully and grounded in, and not do the ones that actually are going to throw you off of your grounding right now. And that means your most central being, not the things that you're like, I don't know if that doesn't feel so great to me, but like the things that you're like, I cannot do this and stay in my purpose and my principle, right? And get really clear about those agreements with whoever you're forming your pod with, whether it's other clergy and faith leaders in your city, if it's other members of your community. Have those conversations about what is your spectrum around nonviolence, right? And you can take that tactic list and figure out, right, here's the ones we already know how to do, and say like, these are ones we will not participate in, and these are ones that we will, and learn what those look like. Think about other things around your action agreements, right? What are the kind of risks that you want to take? For some folks, those risks may include things around boundaries around COVID-19. So for some folks, that may include risks around things like intentionally risking arrest. For some folks, that may mean things around other kinds of spaces that you may or may not be in. But take the time to figure out what are the limits of your risk together, right? And that is going to be critical to thinking about your action agreements. Go ahead and articulate for yourselves what are your cornerstones that you will come back to, right? An action agreement may include something like, we will only speak to the press, right, if we've been directed to by someone who's planned the action. That can be an action agreement that you set, That can be a commitment that guides you in your work, right? An action agreement can be, we will not de-escalate if we are not the official de-escalators of an action, right? Knowing, as Reverend Blackman mentioned, that oftentimes stepping into a role of de-escalation when you're not the de-escalator can actually escalate situations. And so figuring out how to like temper your role there, right? And so get clear about those kind of things so that you all can move in alignment when you are together. And the second thing is to be thinking about quick decisions. If you've been in particularly some of the protests over the summer, some of the things over the last few years, learning how quickly we have to figure out how to make decisions, right? And it's going to be a cornerstone of how we stay safe together and we stay within those action agreements. And so quick decisions is a part of getting a process and a practice together. For some folks, that is a consensus model. And I invite you to explore different models that work for you. But I wanted to model right now some of what we've done over the last couple of nights in Philadelphia. If Koach and Cecily want to come off of mute and join me for a moment. So as was mentioned, the last couple of nights in West Philadelphia have gotten rather hectic and unpredictable, and I've had a lot of activity and action. And the past 2 nights in a row, there's been a call for clergy folks and faith leaders to show up in the streets. And though that call has been met both nights. And we have shown up with other clergy folks. Bro, would you mind putting on the appropriate hat? This is clergy swag, making sure that you are also helicopters over my house. We also all live within walking distance of one another. So I'm sure it's the same helicopters, but don't let that lull you into thinking it's any less concerning. So when we show up, what I like to do is to, once we've arrived at our location, particularly because we've been going and meeting with like a designated set of clergy that we have relationship to already on the ground, and someone has pre-communicated with them, is to take a pause to check in with everybody. I just want to model a little bit about like what that conversation can look like and encourage you to be thinking about what is a similar conversation you might want to have with your people, your pod, whoever they may be, before you go out. So oftentimes we pull up and say, okay, let's first check where are we leaving the car?
This is 54th and Pine.
Thank you. All right, going to leave the car at 54th and Pine. Is everybody clear? 54th and Pine is where the car is. Great. So if we do get separated at some point, this is our rallying point, is to come back here to 54th and Pine. We don't know the route and what might happen tonight. So 54th and Pine.
54th and Pine.
54th and Pine. Great. I want to check in real quick about like what are our limitations on activity tonight. Are there things that feel like they're outside of the scope of how y'all want to engage this evening, or that you might want to say it's time to go home right now?
I don't want to get arrested tonight.
Okay. No arrests?
I don't want to run tonight.
Not trying to be chased and no running tonight. Okay. Those feel aligned with what I need for this evening as well. You know, I think for this is the third night going out, and I'm definitely feeling a little bit more activated as well. So I definitely would prefer not to get arrested, and would prefer also if I need to step away with folks for a moment just to like get some breath, because y'all know I do not like crowds. Despite this work I do not like crowds. It would be great if somebody could just take a step back with me so I don't get separated from the crowd. With everybody.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So we are not getting arrested tonight. We are doing our best to not have to take off running. So we're all gonna be paying attention. If things feel like they're escalating to that point, then we will check in, and that will be our call to leave. Does that feel like that's a good time to like call to leave? If we feel like, oh, it's time to run, that's time to go.
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
Okay. So we will be departing then. Ideally, when we get to the space, can we first just check out the kind of entry and exit ways to make sure that we have a clear route to leave when it's time to leave, if needed?
Yes.
Great. And again, the car is at
54th and Pine.
54th and Pine, and we will return here if we need to. Thank y'all. All right. That is not an extensive version of what that conversation might look like, but the intention is to give you a bit of an idea of we're checking in about our limitations, right? And checking in about our limitations without judgment, without, I don't need to know like why someone may not want to get arrested this evening. I don't need to know like why someone may not run, but to just that may also we know each other and we've been out here and things like that. Those may be things you need to know. I'm not discounting that, but I'm saying that getting to a point where you can have the conversation about clarity about your limitations and your boundaries. What are you willing to try to engage with this evening in this example? And what are we not willing to engage with, right? And trying to be as clear as possible about what are the decisions we know we're going to have to make. Um, the purpose of that is so that when we get to the point of the evening, where over the last couple of evenings things have escalated, we have clarity about what our boundaries are and we can move in that way, right? Because our action agreements say that if we come together, we leave together, right? Unless like we come together, we leave together, period, right? So if one person says, I don't want to risk arrest tonight, then we've all agreed that we're not risking arrest tonight, right? Those are part of the agreements for how we move. That does not have to be for everyone. But again, the purpose is getting really clear about what are the boundaries about how you move. And part of that is that boundary around what is the scope of nonviolent action that feels correct for you. And part of it is about what is the scope and spectrum of risk that feels right to you, and communicate that with your people. The other kind of things about like legal support and what number you should have in your arm, those things are also very critical. And you can find the information for the National Lawyers Guild. You can find information for other local support things that are happening and encourage you to have those on you. And do not miss the part of getting clear about who are the people, who are the other people and bodies that you will be moving with, right? And thank you. Some models and some folks, if they have larger groups, they do assign different people and practice different kinds of decision making. We've been moving as a pretty small group of people, and so we kind of set with right now, what are our limitations? When do we go? When do we not go? That includes things like or being clear about what becomes a decision maker. We were out last night, and one of the people with us has asthma, and so we decided as a group that if it felt like their asthma would be triggered, we are all leaving because we were unwilling to risk, right, the potential of them having an asthma attack, and we let that be the decision. And for us last night, that was period. It was when they said, right, I feel like my breathing is becoming complicated, then it was done. Whether that was because of um, things in the air, or if it was because of kind of the anxiety and stress of being in the street, it was when that was called, it was time for us to go, right? And again, some groups will decide. We got to witness a couple nights ago a group pause and have out a conversation in the street about what they were going to do, and watch them in live time make a decision with some tension, with some like elevated voices, right? But they stood there and they like held their ground and they held off a street while they made a decision about what they were going to do. And ultimately, what they decided was to split the group off into two. And one part of the group would go in one direction and the other part of the group would go in another direction. And that, I assume, was in line with how they decided to make decisions. But again, it is useful to be thinking about ahead of time. How do you want to make decisions? How do you make decisions as quickly as possible? And please do not discount the figuring out ahead of time. Like, what are your action agreements? Like, what are your actual limitations and spectrum of activity? That one is going to make it a lot easier when you're actually out there in the street and are like clear. It's going to allow you to be accountable to each other, to call each other back in. It's good for me as a person who kind of like can disappear into a crowd, to be able to say like, Graie, we agreed that we stay together, right? And if I'm saying that that is an agreement I am making with the rest of my pod, then I actually have to adhere to that agreement. Although sometimes I might, but they pull me back. The point is, get clear about these things before starting to move into the street is going to do such a service, both to helping you stay grounded in the street and also doing the work that, as Reverend Blackman said, of keeping the story, right, and keeping our people as safe as possible. And so if we can figure out how to do some of this before we go out there and just try to make it as smooth and tight as possible, everyone is going to be safer and better for it. Because what happens in the chaos is we start to, of course, get activated. right, in our bodies and have an actual physiological response to what is happening around us that can like actually decrease our ability to make the actual decisions that are going to keep us as safe as possible, right? Our bodies jump into fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And sometimes running is the right thing. And also sometimes running is not the thing, right? If you've ever tried running in a large crowd, going back to the violence that we oftentimes see in these mass shopping days, and oftentimes what happens on Black Friday in shopping centers across the country, a lot of that comes from people trying to run together in large crowds, right? And so figuring out together, like, are you going to be like running in a large crowd, or how are you going to move in that, again, is going to feel critical, because I think about it as elementary school fire drill rules. Or if we think about 2020, that could be elementary school um, active shooter drills. That could be all the kind of things that we are training ourselves to be able to do when the moment hits us. And so think about it in that way. The purpose of a fire drill is so that when the fire comes, your body knows how to move and where to go. And so prepare as much as possible, so that if things do become tense and tricky, you're able to actually stay where you need to stay and move how you need to move. Who will do this? Okay. I was going to make a quick pivot and ask you, KB, to do your section, but actually, I'm going to pause because I want to just introduce a couple of things for folks right now, as resources, and then I want to move into that, if that's cool, bro. I just want to talk a couple minutes about security, particularly digital security in the streets. So thinking about digital security, I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat that are resources. I am not a digital security expert. I am a person who is deeply concerned about our collective digital security. But I'm going to drop in the chat a couple of resources. But I want to name that so much of this learning has come through Equality Labs. And when Equality Labs talks about security, they talk about it as the most robust defense against surveillance is a collective one rooted in community, self-care, and accountability. And I think about our digital security practices are one of the ways we have access to being able to keeping each other as safe as possible without having to jeopardize our values in the process, right? To do the kind of digital security stuff we need to do, one, it is cumbersome and it takes a lot of time. And also, as faith leaders and as clergy folks, I imagine that you have access to a lot of possibly sensitive information about people who are in your community of care, either as congregants, as students, as colleagues, as if you do chaplaincy work. And right now, the setup of surveillance is such that during protests, particularly, someone can gain access to a wide amount of data, both for you and for anyone else that you are connected to. And so some of this digital security stuff is a really critical way about how we keep each other safe without having to make assumptions about what does that mean for other people, right? So some of the things to definitely do if you will do nothing else around digital security is to check out this website from Equality Labs, which includes a bunch of resources around how to secure all of your electronic devices. It includes videos on how to do that for iPhone, for an Android phone, how to do that on a Mac, how to do that on a PC. It includes stuff around, it also includes like graphics that have just clearly, here's the different things to do. Ideally, we would all engage in all of them. And knowing that we will not, the baseline things I would ask that folks think about doing is one, download Signal. Signal is a messaging app that also allows you to do phone and video calls. You can also do group messaging. Signal is an end-to-end encrypted messaging service that you can use on your desktop or also on an app on your phone. What that means is if someone was able to gain access to your phone, into encryption means like if they were able to kind of like hack your phone, things like that, they can't necessarily get access to the messages. They would be kind of garbled up. And so particularly things when you're talking with people about sensitive things or like planning activities or reporting out things, I would recommend using Signal for all of those kinds of communications. Second, remove any biometrics that you may have from your phone. That includes fingerprints and facial recognition for unlocking your phone. For some folks, kind of the way you unlock your phone is either through a thumbprint or from it sees your face or your eye. Right now, I know that not everyone is thinking about intentionally risking arrest, but whether you're intentionally risking arrest or you are arrested as a part of an action, police can compel you to unlock your phone if you have biometrics, meaning they can hold your phone to your face or use your hand to unlock your phone and gain access to anything that they can gain access to through your phone. So having a passcode on your phone, if you're going to do a numeric passcode, it should be I think more than 6 to 8 digits, ideally. So not just a 4-digit passcode, and it should not be the same passcode for all of the other things you do. It, for instance, should not be the same passcode as your PIN number for your ATM card. And that's just generally good practice. So that's a second, like just baseline thing that I would, that's a third baseline thing that I would say just at minimum. I know that particularly as folks who are charged with being story keepers, that it may not always be possible in action spaces to not be recording and things like that. Please also check out Equality Labs has some guidance around things to do around digital security, specifically with like photos. If you're trying to share out photos and it is possible to do so without including kind of the kind of data that allows for tracking people down. There's a process called like scrubbing that you can do. And there's a bunch of the resources that are on that Equality Labs link that I please ask you to check out. Again, to be thinking about all the different ways that folks' security may be compromised and ways that we are not planning for and that we do not intend to do. So please do check that out. And if you have not downloaded Signal, if you have not removed the biometrics from your phone, and if you have not added a passcode to your phone, please do so before the next time that you show up in an action. Knowing that while there are times in which we get to plan how much risk we take, there are often times in which we do not get to plan how much risk we take. And so planning for those things to try to keep as many of us as safe as possible is going to be a critical thing. I will say the digital security stuff takes some time and can be a bit complicated. But again, there are videos for how to walk through each and every of the things that they're asking. I have like asked my brother KB over and over again to do some of them. He's done some of them. So hopefully he can attest to it does take a while, but you can do them. And just doing that bare minimum is going to provide a whole lot more security for your people than not. Right? Digital security really operates when the seal is tight. And if you kind of open it, if one of you stops using Signal, then it actually defeats the purpose of using Signal. So thinking also in your action agreements and your decision making with your pod about how will you use those communication technologies and like how will you do so securely. If for your work it makes sense to be using social media, right? Like there's also some guidance from Equality Labs about how to do that as securely as possible. Please download Signal, start using it. Please take the biometrics off of your phone as a way to unlock it. And please add a secure passcode onto your phone at the bare minimum to keep people safe. I won't go into all the like scary things that can happen when people are not safe in terms of their digital security, but please do those basic things. So we've been here for about an hour and 22 minutes. And I mentioned, there's a baby. And I mentioned that, right, like all of this work is about how do we show up and practice disciplined, nonviolent action as a part of action and in the streets, as we will be called to do and as we will call ourselves and call one another to do. And so much of what I'm learning is, particularly in this world where we're all on Zoom, is how much of it that we miss in terms of like the being in our body for it, right? And if we were actually able to be together, we would do things like, hassle lines, and we would do all these kind of things that if you've been in direct action trainings before, we're not doing here because this is a webinar on Zoom, and I'm kind of looking at the only people I can see and talking to them and hoping it translates as being, I don't know, friendly or accessible as a talker on a webinar. So hopefully that's working. But I want to take us into a space a little bit about thinking about being in our bodies in the street. And I'm gonna invite again my brother Koach to share with us, like, thinking about, like, what have you learned? Are there like practices or things you want to offer about like how we stay grounded? Again, that charge that Reverend Blackman gave us about, like, showing up in this work and being clear about who you stand for and what you stand for, and letting it like be in your person, being rooted in it and not letting it go, right? You don't have to become the Incredible Hulk outside if you're not the Incredible Hulk. But you also don't have to become small if you're not small, right? And so how do we stay grounded?
Thank you, Graie, Brother Graie. Amazing wisdom. Thank you for sharing it and keeping me grounded when we've been out on the street, because God knows it's been harrowing to be there. I want to ask questions and just invite people to think this through with me. One of the things that helps me stay grounded when I'm outside on the street is to think through my own anxieties, stress, triggers, so that when I go out on the street, I can figure out how to keep my own self together, and I don't actually create what Reverend Blackman was talking about, is like creating harm for other folks while we're out there together. So the first question is, think through what are the things that are stress or anxieties that would actually create a response in your body. So for me, it's seeing police officers on a tank with semi-automatic weapons, which is what I experienced nightly in Ferguson. That actually brings me anxiety, and my body's going to react whether I want it to or not. And so I have also developed practices to soothe myself, so that when that's happening, I can do what I need to do so that I'm not doing the thing that might distract the organizers of the protest or the event, and also that I can then return to my most resourced self. So think about one or two things that you could do to soothe yourself. I'm going to give you a couple. You can use these, or you can find others that work for you. But here's a practice, and I hope you can see. Maybe I'll do this so you can see my body. So one of the things is you can cross your body like this. You can do it on your chest, or you can do it on your legs, and you just gently tap. And what this is called butterfly, by the way, and I learned this through the Healing Network. They have another name, but Healing Network is part of their name. And this reminds me of being in my mama or my daddy's lap, and them just, whenever anything was going wrong, they would just gently tap me and tell me everything's okay. So if that's what you need to do, and say, Koach, everything is going to be okay. Or hear my grandma say, baby, this ain't going to last always. Whatever it is you need to tell yourself, right? And you can see that just automatically I start to rock. It's an automatic thing to, like, this returns me to a more resourced part of myself, where I can then, Community Healing Network, thank you. That gives me back to a place where I can be okay. I know that there is something in front of me that is triggering me, and I'm returning back to center. Okay. There's another one that you can do, and it's called lotion. And this one is where you actually think about that luxurious lotion that, I don't know, maybe it has a scent, maybe it doesn't, because you might have allergies, but whatever it is, you are imagining that from the top of your shoulder down all the way down, like go all the way down, get it off your hands. Like we're not trying to like rub it in, but we're trying to like get it in and out, right? We're rubbing this tension, this stress, we're getting it out. You can do it on your legs. You can do it wherever it feels comfortable, but get the stress out. Yeah. That's one thing you can do to help. So there are many more practices that people do, but those are just two that are like in my body that I know right away. I know what to do. I'll share one more. I go through all the senses and figure out what I can what I can sense. So look at something. Can I smell something? Can I taste something? Can I feel something? Like going through the senses and figuring out whether or not there's something that I can engage with my senses in that moment. Those are ways to kind of ground me, get me back into my body and my mind so that I can be with the people. And then one thing that I used to do when I was with a group of people, I had a group called Justice Beats in St. Louis, and we would ragtag group of people. Not all of us came from the same place. Like we would all meet up at the march together, and we would set intentions with each other. So similar to what Graie was saying earlier, we're making agreements with each other about how we are going to move in the street. We would set intentions for why we showed up. And this is a way for us to like all be on the same page. Like I showed up because I wanted, we did this earlier. You said, I this is what I stand for. And this is very similar, but like, let's get together about what we are going to do collectively as we have showed up together. Right. And so some of it is like, I'm here because I want to help with the energy here, or I want to help lead chants, or I want to help, keep folks safe, but be clear on what your intentions are. And let's see, read the room. There was a question about like, should we like pray? Should we do these other things? I would read the space, figure out what's happening. If you haven't talked to the organizers, let them know that you're there. Having something that identifies you, either you have a hat, or maybe you have a attire that identifies you as a clergy person. Have that on, but also know that could be triggering to other people, right? I think we were having a conversation in the chat about how like praying can actually trigger folks if they've been in spaces that have been harmful to them, in spiritual spaces. And so read the space, figure out whether or not you're actually your presence, beyond your presence, you're welcome to be there to do these things. And if at all possible, coordinate with the people who have organized the march or the protest to determine what would be best. I would think about these three things. If I am in need of, say, doing a chant, I would want to determine, again, reading the space, but determine whether or not the energy is high or low or in the middle. And if we're trying to, if something, spirit or the people who organized the event have said it's time to change the energy. So for instance, when I tell a short story, is that okay, Graie? Okay. So it was the night of the announcement of the indictment in Ferguson. And I had gone out to across the street from the police station, and they had just announced that they were not going to indict the police officer. So as you can imagine, people had some feelings about that. And I arrived there slightly after that moment had happened. People were starting to do things that felt good to them in order to express their feelings. And so when I got there, I have a drum, and I took out the drum, and there happened to be another clergy person standing next to me, and who was literally terrified. And I said, come on, we need to figure out what we're going to do. And so in that moment, I took out my drum and I said, there needs to be an energy shift, right? Because I saw 3 or 4 lines of not only National Guards folks, but police. And they had more weaponry than we did. All we had was our bodies. And so in that moment, I took out my drum and I started drumming and chanting, I know that we will win, because we needed to know in that moment that we were going to win, that it didn't matter what was happening, that the reality is that they just not going to indict this man because the system is built for that to happen, but we will collectively win this fight, right? And so we needed a shift in energy. It wasn't one of those moments to sing, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it. It wasn't that moment. So we need to know when the moment is to sing those kind of songs, and when is the moment that we need to encourage our people to say, "No, we gonna get this. We gonna be all right." And to have the energy up enough so that they know that they can sink into it, right? So those are kind of the big, I think, the big ideas that I wanted to share with you all. And if there's other questions later, I'll be more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Ro. I'm dropping in the chat real quick some additional kind of somatic or embodiment practices. These are ones that are meant to be things that you can do, similar to what Koach just introduced to us. Some like ones you can do kind of with yourself, also ones that you can do in a group. So it's a very short, like 16-minute podcast. Definitely encourage you to try those on. I also say, as a person who oftentimes is very much known as like not wanting to do these things. And if we were in a space together and somebody was like, all right, we're all going to do this, I would characteristically leave the room. And so saying this may not be the most comfortable for everyone, and still encourage you then to find what is the practice that is going to help ground you, right? And for some folks that may be just like, maybe there's a place on your body that you hold and take a couple breaths into. Right? For some folks, that may be a hand on the chest and a hand on the belly, right? And just practice breathing that way for a couple of breaths, and that may recenter you. So find what it is that is actually going to support you, so that you can be in a place. If we have more time, I'd love that we could go all and talk about polyvagal theory and like how do you bring yourself back into the safe and social place and activate the right part of your nervous system. The point is, like the way we react to Koach's earlier question is physiological. Our bodies are developed to protect us, and what it does is oftentimes it creates a story when our state shifts. So when we start to feel like we are unsafe, right, we respond with that fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Right? And all of us have different ones. And so also spend some time getting clear with yourself about that, so that you can again like show up with your pod mates about like being able to name some of the things that you know about yourself that you may need to call in, right? There is no shame about the ways that your body responds to being triggered. I say this as a person who has a phobia, that there are moments in which, like, if my phobia gets activated, I will go from being right here in my own home where everything is exactly where I need it to be, to being convinced that, how many people are on this call? That the other 65 of you who are on this call, who started with beautiful visions about why you are here and who you stand for and what you stand for, and I can get activated around my phobia and be convinced that the 65 of y'all I cannot see are somehow a part of like some plot to get me, right? Because our physiology gets queued up, and we very instantaneously and quickly get to a point of like reactivity, right? So figure out what is that embodiment somatic practice that's going to help bring you back down, right? Those kind of mindfulness stuff that Koach mentioned, whether it's like, figuring out the thing you can hold in your pocket, right? If there's something for you in your tradition that makes sense to come back to, right? There are things that we hold close in that way. So figure out what those things are and make those a part of how you move. The second one was also what Koach was talking about in terms of how do you use chants and song as a way to, again, ground yourself, right? I know that whenever I start chanting, my body, I can feel the shift of my body, right? I can feel the actual way that I am changing, right? I'm also, I do judge chants. I'm not going to lie to y'all. I have preferences, and I like good chants. That being said, part of it is because I understand the power to actually shift my body, right? Whenever I've been in a crowd and I start hearing that drum, right, I know that there's something happening, right, and that the energy will be shifted.
Can I say one more thing about this prayer and chant? I just want to say, like, sometimes this impulse to like want to pray out loud with other people could be an impulse coming from our own need to pray. And so I would like ask the question, is this for me or is this for other people, or other people asking for that? and to try it out on yourself. So when I'm like feeling anxious and I'm like, I really need to say something out loud, then I pray to myself. And maybe take that prayer internally so that you can further ground yourself in, and then like figure out what other people might need around you.
Thank you. So somebody was thinking about the what is it, the oxygen mask rule? I'm trying to equate like thinking about oxygen mask rules, right? Like it is the figure out first how to get your breath in a place where you need it to be, and then assist the next person, right? Cecily, we're gonna pause here and make some space for questions. Yeah, are there questions coming through for us? Or if there are specific questions you want us to turn our attention to?
I know people have been putting questions in the chat. We've been responding. So I'm wondering for people, just take a minute and think about what's still coming up for you and what would be helpful to hear these very talented folks respond to.
So I can start with this question I see here, and then as other questions come in, we can answer those. I see a question asking if we can comment about how to help support others when triggered by PTSD by certain symbols they didn't anticipate. So I'm assuming that the question is, how do you help someone else who is being triggered? I have a couple of answers, and part of it is going to be repeating some of what we just shared. One is like, as you're thinking about both those like grounding practices for yourself, thinking about what are the ones also that can live in relationship to other people in a way that maintains that person's safety, and particularly around trauma being triggered. Safety is about being able to make choices, right? Both to say yes and to say no to things. And so always approaching people with some balanced check-in about consent, right? Meaning, if you see someone who is visibly having a response to something, if your reaction is to like hug them, which is a lot, some people's reaction when they see someone else grieving or in pain or afraid, figuring out ways to check in with that person first is a critical thing, right? Not everyone responds well, and that actually does not feel safe to lots of people. So myself, again, as an example, when I'm triggered around my phobia, touching me is the last thing that a person should do. Actually, touching me will actually further activate and drop me down what's called the polyvagal ladder, right? And so some of that, again, is within your pod, the people you know, again, having that kind of check-in, right? Not because you have to disclose all of your trauma histories, but that question of, is there anything that I need to know about you to keep you safe and to keep me safe, right? And so that include, we didn't do like in our, when we modeled the pre-check-in, that would have been a question, right? Are there things I don't already know about you that you want to remind me of that's going to keep you safe and that's going to keep me safe, right? That could look like, I don't know if you all have ever had the experience, but when you're out somewhere and you find out that one of your friends has a gun, is usually not fun. So check in first. Or you realize one of your friends turns into the Incredible Hulk when they are triggered or upset and you didn't know. It's not fun. So in that regard, check in with your people first about what they need. And then when you're dealing with people that you do not know or have relationship with, developing out the practice to be able to like check in about like what is going to maintain safety for another person as well, which might mean boundarying your own instincts around like wanting to do what all. And figuring out there are ways to engage other people in the ways that you try to show up with care for them. Koach, I don't know if you have other things you want to share in your experience around that.
Yeah, I would just say lean into what you know and ask for help from other people when you don't know. Don't get into malpractice and thinking you know how to help folks with PTSD if you don't know. So if that's a thing that you're wanting to be learned in, get the training, take the workshops, and also if there are people who you already know have that understanding and experience, I would say pot up with some of those people so that you have that support. But I would encourage you not to do anything that you are unclear is the kind of best practice when working with people who are experiencing trauma actively.
Thank you. The one other thing I will say about that is also holding, right, that the way that people show up, particularly when triggered, again, it is a physiological response in which our bodies, literally our nervous system shifts and our brain shifts. And that's when we get thrown into that fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. So also holding that the way that people show up when they're in a traumatized state may be different than the way that you may encounter them outside of that. And that also goes back into when we're talking about kind of the relationship to nonviolence and moralizing, is the reality is quite often we're seeing people who are deeply in a prolonged traumatized state or an acute like trauma state, who are active in the street. So thinking about what it means to be also like thinking about trauma in relationship to violence as well. If your goal is to be thinking about how do you show up in that kind of like street chaplaincy kind of way. And just to restate, like, if you do not know how to support someone who is triggered around like PTSD, it might actually be the best thing to not, honestly. And so some of that's going to be making those kind of decisions about like, what are you actually capable of, and trying not to do things where you are not the best suited to do them. Other questions for those who have not been out in the street and not connected yet: how can we know where to be most useful and how to become engaged? I'm wondering, Cecily, if you have any guidance about like how folks can get connected, where folks can find out where things are happening.
Yeah, so I put in the chat, it's just a form to, I'll drop it again in just a second, to make sure that you're getting updates about faith mobilizing. And we are going to do our best to make sure that any place around the country that groups of faith are mobilizing, especially in 12 key states where we expect things to get really rough in the next couple of weeks, that we're sending those updates out. So that's the best thing. A number of organizations are going to be holding big actions on November 7th, the Saturday after the election, when we anticipate that we're going to have to be putting pressure to continue counting. The counts will take a long time. And so, yeah, as many of you as possible can look out for those and plug in through our work.
Thank you, Cecily. I have another question here coming through. I'm not clergy. May I use these techniques at our nonviolent actions? I am also not clergy. Use all of the things. Cecily is not clergy. Koach is clergy in training. I encourage you to use all of the techniques and tactics that feel, again, like they keep you rooted in those core questions that Reverend Blackman already invited us into, about like, who do you stand for and what do you stand for? That those can be guiding anchors, and thinking about whether it's those 198 tactics of nonviolence are for all the people, if they're these grounding somatic practices are for all the people, all the things for all the people. Another question is, what support role can clergy who for health or identity reasons can't be directly in the streets protesting play? I think also, again, maybe Cecily, if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, so I think it's, in this season, I've heard a lot of conversation about how not every there are a lot of different roles in the movement, and I'm going to look in a second. There's some really beautiful images around this, but there are a lot of different roles in the movement. There's a lot of ways that you can support people who are on the streets, whether that's sending them a meal, it's donating to bail funds for people who get arrested. Last night I sent delivery to somebody who was out on the streets who I knew hadn't eaten when they came home, because I have little kids and I couldn't go out last night. And then it's like amplifying the message. If this is seen as, oh, just those crazy people out on the street, then it's easy to isolate this work. When you are talking with your friends and neighbors about what people are saying, why people are out on the streets, other people who aren't comfortable going out, so that it doesn't seem like some radicalized thing. When you're retweeting, resharing direct accounts from people on the street, because often the narrative gets very, we see this in Philly today. It's like, oh no, property got destroyed. But when you're sharing accounts on the street, we saw a video of police pulling people out of their cars, smashing their windows in front of little children. So when you share the actual real stories that are coming from the ground, that's really powerful and important too, because it validates the people who are there risking their safety.
Thank you, Cecily. There's also a question about aftercare and like supporting ourselves following protest activity. And I'm wondering, Koach, if you could say a few words about that.
Love to. Just to go back to how we have developed practices in order to soothe ourselves kind of in the moment. So we need to practice those. We also need to be in active practice around how to release energy after high stress and high anxiety situations. And so what I would suggest is I wish I had this video on top of my head. Maybe I'll find it. But there's a video of an animal, and like it was actively being pursued, and like almost like another animal was trying to kill it. And so it did its freeze thing, right? But when it was done, it literally just shook it out. It shook all of that, like the shock and the stress and the anxiety out. That's one way, just really simply, to get it out your body. You can also dance, do physical activity, exercise. These are ways to just like get it out. Also, people have developed other practices like you don't want to integrate this stuff. So, like actually having massages or doing meditation isn't actually something that you want to do. You need to get it out of your body. So, I would suggest doing that. And then I do want to also respond very quickly to the last thing that we were talking about. If you are in like a pod or you kind of at a larger clergy association or group, find out whether or not folks are going out and you're staying in, and be in touch with them. If you can be a resource to them so that like they can call on you if something's going on out there, that they know that you're a person who would respond, be that person, and or be the person that if it's right for you and you can be in a chaplaincy kind of role, to be that resource for the person after they come out from the street so they can process.
One other thing for clergy, especially who aren't comfortable, I mean, I forgot something so obvious. You speak to massive communities of people. You have so much reach. And so sharing these messages at the pulpit is crucial. And we have actually put some tools together to make that possible. This weekend is our Keep the Faith, Count Every Vote weekend of action. And I'm going to ask that Sarah from Faith and Public Life drop the materials in the chat. But there's a whole set of resources to talk to your congregations about the fact that we're not getting any results on election night. If we do, that's probably a bad sign. And we all need to be grounded. People will be looking to communities of faith to say, is this okay? What's going on? And to just tell people to be calm and patient. That is a hugely important role that people of faith can play in this moment, even if they're not going on the streets.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to start moving into the close of our time together. And I actually shockingly feel like energized by being in this space with y'all tonight. And so I want to invite folks to do a quick thing with me, and then we're going to go back to watch the remainder of our video from Reverend Blackman's statements, and then my brother Koach is going to close us out in a song. But I'm going to ask that we hold something while we're going into this video. I now get to spend some time with my niece on video, helping with her homework, and she was stressed out the other day. She told me she was afraid. And so I was like, oh, remember, KB, she loves KB. I was like, he said, do this and that. She was like, I don't want to do that. That does not feel grounding to me. She did it. And you could tell it was not shifting her. It wasn't doing the thing. So I tried another thing and she was like, no. All right. And then I said, well, let's try this one. How about you just do this? I'm just invite folks just to start rubbing your hands together in whatever way feels good. Right. You notice as you're rubbing, you might be generating some heat. And with my niece, she decided that she wanted to add some things into this. She decided this was a cauldron, and she wanted to add in some specific things that she could carry with her. And since I can't hear y'all, and I don't actually want to ask you to take your hands away and go on chat, so I'm just actually going to ask that you, wherever you are, in whatever voice and volume you want to just name part of what you want to put into all of this. Thinking about that, who you stand for and what you stand for. What is the thing you want to be taking with you from this time we've spent together that you want to put into this little batch of something we got going right here? Amen. Right? And we're going to come back to it. You can whisper it in there if you want to. Right? I'm going to ask you to find, if it's comfortable for you to take it to your heart area. My niece really liked this one. It helped bring her back to herself and had a little bit of extra love in there as well. So we're going to go back to Reverend Blackman right now. When we come back together, we're going to figure out what we did with our little batch.
Law enforcement got angry with us. We stood with them even when law enforcement called us traitors. We stood with them even when our collars made us targets instead of made us accomplices of law enforcement. You need to know what you stand for, who you stand for, before you go out into the streets. You are not there to police or to limit other people's expressions because they do things differently than you might do them. That is not helpful. The other thing clergy did, because so much violence happens in the dark, right, is that we orchestrated an identity garment for ourselves. I hated it. It looked like Elmer Fudd, but it was a neon garment that had clergy on the back, and there were caps as well that said clergy. And that wasn't really so much for identification for law enforcement as for identification for protesters who might need to talk to someone, who might need to step away for a moment and gather themselves, who might need the priest instead of the prophet for a moment. We were there identified in ways that the protesters who were often on the front lines, who were being tear gassed, etc., knew where we were and knew how to find us. The third thing I want to say, and I know my time is almost up, I want to say very clearly that it is not the role of clergy to negotiate on behalf of those leading the protests. Don't ever go to meetings with police officers, with legislators, with state officials. Don't ever go without the ones who are leading the protest. If they don't go, you cannot go. Because the other thing you are building in the streets is a trustworthy reputation, and that matters. Finally, if you have houses of faith that are in the perimeter or in the area of the protest, I urge you to not only go as an individual, but to bring your congregation into this fight. And it is a fight. So often in protest, when tear gas started going and rubber bullets were going, it was sad that so many church doors were closed. So many people didn't want to be places of retreat and risk their buildings, risk their institutions, risk their relationships to keep people safe from harm. And one of the ways churches can show up, one of the ways synagogues can show up, one of the ways temples can show up is to open your doors and be identified as a safe place for protesters when they need to come and have chemicals washed out of their eyes or removed from their skin, when they need a break from the intensity in the streets. Provide snacks, provide water, provide PPE, provide those things that will help people cleanse their eyes and cleanse their skin. The last thing I want to say is that prayer is always appropriate for those of us who believe. But prayer does not have to be public, does not have to be forced on others to be effective. Take your prayer with you, but pray with your feet and follow the leadership of those who have been in the streets, who know what's going on. Respect that leadership. Respect that leadership and keep the story. Thank you.
Amen. To move into our final close, Koach and I are going to quickly model something, thinking about the role of chants and music, and as they were speaking about the way that it shifts energy, but also gives directives. And so thinking about just for a moment of being at an action, right? And starting to notice that energy is shifting and needing to hold the space, right? As people may start to be moving away and you don't know where people are going, the way you can use a chant or a song to help people like stay grounded and just literally hold the space might sound like,
we shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like the stream that's planted by the water. Oh, we shall not be moved.
Thank you. Now, as Reverend Blackman also implores us to do, to be in movement together, to be marching forward, whether we take our instructions from the way Michael Walzer thinks about it, that wherever you are, it's probably Egypt, and the goal is to, like, you know, gather together and move forward through the wilderness. I'm butchering that, and you understand, right? Or if it's in my tradition, we started our Torah portion this week with Lech Lecha, and you shall go to a land that I will show you. That we are in a moment of now moving forward together and figuring out what that looks like. So we're going to end our time, and you are free to leave the call unless there's no more announcements. You'll get follow-up things. And we're going to end our call this way, being implored about moving forward together.
We are marching in the light of God. 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 We are marching, we are marching, ooh, we are marching in the light of God. We are marching, ooh, we are marching in the light of God. I believe.
I believe.
I believe that we will win.
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 I know.
I know.
I know that we will win.
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 There it is.
Dream well, dear spirits, dear bodies. Take care of yourselves. Connect with one another. Please follow up with the instructions Cecily has given to us. Thank you so much, Faith and Public Life.
Thank you, everyone.
So much, all the people.